ask you about your memories and your past and all kinds of stuff. Okay.
Yeah, right.
So why don't we get started with tell me some of your earliest memories of living at home. What was it like for you as a child?
Well, I was particularly blessed. I was the only grandchild on either side for 5 years. Wait a minute. In that case, I had all the attention in the world because my grandparents, because I lived in Texas, were so anxious to see me every summer. No matter what I did, it didn't make any difference. Unfortunately for my mother. But anyway, my sister was born 5 years later, and my cousin. So therefore, I didn't have quite as much attention, but I'll have to admit that I was always the favorite. And I used to think my sister was my mother's favorite because she got measles from me when I was 18. When she was 18 months old, it affected her eyes, and she walked around holding my mother's skirt because, you know, they didn't have plastic glasses. They only had regular glasses. And my mother was afraid she was going to fall, so she wouldn't let her run or anything. And of course, then I had my brother when I was 9. He came along, and so she couldn't climb trees, and she was an outcast for years, because when she grew up and got married. So I really had the most attention of any child you ever saw, and I think it helps. That's the reason I was very loving with Morton, and I took him to see his grandparents on both sides because I thought it was important for my background that he had all that attention.
Do they live in Kansas City? So you're
Both sides of my family lived in Kansas City.
And then what made your parents?
Well, here's what happened.
Yeah.
My father came to Texas because he was the oldest nephew of my great uncle, and he owned a winery down here.
Who was your great uncle?
His name was Jake Shinosky. And these people, he was, first he stopped in Oklahoma. He was really a character. He was in the land drive, you know, the land rush in Oklahoma. Then he met a girl there and he married her. And they opened a saloon, and he always tells the story that he'd have her carry the money to the bank in a wash tub, and he'd hold the pistol so no one could see it. But anyway, he finally made his way to Texas, and he opened this winery. And then, of course, you know, came Prohibition. So my father didn't have a job. And that was, he didn't really have to work, my great uncle did. But he liked to be busy, he was always doing something. Anyway, my father was going to go back to Kansas City and take us back to Kansas City. And his best friend was named Ben Levy, who was the father of Milton and Louis Levy. Dr. Levy is a dentist here, and he lives upstairs now. But our parents, see, I was really supposed to marry him according to his parents and my parents. But it never works out, you know that. Anyway, so he said, I just can't lose you as a friend. We're just crazy about y'all. And he said, why don't you learn that he had just had a stroke? And my father saved his life. My father had to be in the store, and he saved him from falling through a glass window when he had that stroke. And he said, you know, I'm not in good health, and I want you to learn the business. So my father said, okay. It was the jewelry business. And eventually my father owned that store. It became Peacock's, and then it became Sterling's. You remember?
Sure, of course. Of course. So how did your dad meet your mom?
Well, they met each other in Kansas City. They knew each other and were going together before my father came down here. He came down here to Texas, and then he went back to Kansas City to be married. because everybody was in Kansas City, our whole family, except for my great uncle was down here.
Right.
I mean, up there.
Right. So he met your mom.
So he met her and married her later. After he had been here a couple of years, he would go back for a holiday or something. Then the train was running regular from here to Kansas City, you know. So it was really no chore. And so when Uncle Ben, I call him Uncle because I always called him Uncle and Aunt, you know, Aunt Celine. Celine was Milton's mother. And so he went to work for them. And eventually it all worked out, you know. And then during the war, he sold the store out in Fort Worth because some man in Wichita Falls contacted him. And by that time, Brutus and I were married.
Okay, so now we're going to have to go back. Okay, now we're going to go back. No, that's great.
Yeah.
That's great. So tell me, so what was it like growing up in Fort Worth for you?
Well, Fort Worth was probably the greatest place in the world to grow up. There was no anti-Semitism, perceptibly, you know. And at that time, say on the weekends, if they had a dance, you know, there would be, every school would go. It wasn't just one, that all would go to the casino. And they had all the big bands. They had Kay Kaiser, and they had all kinds of people come. Red Nichols and his Five Pennies, and everybody else. And we were dancing fools. And the boys had no money. It was a nickel a dance. So you danced with the one which brung you. Every third dance, he could afford probably 50 cents for the whole evening. Because it was the Great Depression, you know. See, I was born the year 1918, and that's the year that World War I ended. And I was married in 36, and the Depression had already started.
Wow. So where did you go? Did you also go to Pasco High School?
Brutus's mother went to Pasco. Brutus went to Pasco. I went to Pasco, and Horton went to Pasco. All of us. So his parents came over there, went to Fort Worth around the turn of the century, see? His father was sent by Julia Schiff's group from New York because they thought there were too many Jewish people there. And they trained him to be a tailor. And there wasn't a tailor in Fort Worth. There were some in Dallas, but none in Fort Worth. So they sent him to Fort Worth.
And what was it, who were your friends like? What were they like? What was your social life? You know,
Oh, well, that was easy. My mother belonged to, they called it a sewing club, which they did. And all of them were very talented women and very good cooks, and they sewed. They made fixed needlepoint, they'd fix things for the temple, they'd make drapes for the temple, and my father and all this group, the husbands, they built a theater in the downstairs, which was the recreation room, built a stage. My uncle was an electrician. My dad's sister came down to visit, and they introduced her to a man named Gus Landman. And he was an electrician, and he was the co-owner of a big electrical company in Fort Worth. And so they built that stage, they wired it, they did everything. They put in the floors, and our mothers put in the drapes and everything, and it was really, we were more like a family, the whole congregation in Fort Worth at that time, because it wasn't very big.
how big was it?
It finally had 300 members, and today they have 300 members.
Amazing. Were your friends mostly Jewish? I mean, how did they
Oh
work
yeah,
at school?
but although they were, I was in a sorority that was this group from all over town. I think I was the only Jewish girl in it, come to think of it. I can't think of any others that were in it. So I was kind of a nutty happy-go-lucky person. I liked everybody, you know. And I only had one bad experience. And I used to go with this fellow named Jim Nance. He's a lawyer in Houston now. And he invited me to go. It'd be his day. He was the valedictorian, the president of his class. He was 2 or 3 years older than I was. He invited me to go with him. And there was one teacher. I'd never run into this before, and I didn't know how to act. And she told him, she took him aside and said, "Who are you taking to the banquet, senior banquet?" And he said, "I'm taking Bernice Meyerson." And he said, "Do you know she's Jewish?" He said, "Of course I know she's Jewish." She said, "You shouldn't take her. And I don't want you to take her." And when his best friend told me, he wouldn't tell me. And I got hysterical, and I wasn't the type. And one of the teachers saw me and said, "What in the world is the matter? Is she hurt or what?" And his best friend happened to be with me. And he said no, and told the teacher what happened. And he went to the principal. And that teacher almost got fired.
Wow.
And the funny thing was that her sister, I was her sister's favorite. She was the PE teacher. And I played volleyball and this ran on track and everything like that, because I was a tomboy. And it was just, that was like somebody hit me over the head with a hammer, because I'd never run into anything like that. But he was such a wonderful man, Mr. Pascal. It was called Central then. And they later named the school for him, and I was glad.
And that was the teacher that...
And that was the principal of the school. But in his quiet way, he told her that it was not her prerogative. He said, "You are not the boy's parents. If they don't care, it's none of your business. And besides, you should never have an attitude like that." He wasn't a prejudiced bone in his mind. That's the only time in the whole time of my childhood that I knew there was any difference, because actually, I didn't know the difference, because I was it never occurred to me not to sing the Christmas carols.
About being Jewish in Fort Worth. Did your parents care? What was it like in terms of integration with your life? Did you ever think you'd marry somebody that wasn't Jewish? Did it matter?
No.
No.
I wouldn't. I never thought I would. But my mother was crazy about this fellow I went with. His name was Jim Nance. He was John Nance Garner's nephew. And he was the president of the class and everything, and a football player, like I told you. And then he was so smart. He went to Rice, and the poor thing would play a football game, and then he would hitchhike down here so he could see me on Sundays. My mother would tell him he was crazy.
So how come you didn't marry him?
Well, as I got older, and he was down there, and then he went to law school, and he was a chemical engineer, and he was in school forever, So I grew away from it,
And was that around the same time you met Bernice?
Yeah.
So what was that like? Tell us what it was like for you.
Well, that was so much fun, because this shows you how chance things happen. My mother called him to come over and give her a quote on some insurance, and I was in the living room sitting there listening to the record. That's where the record player was, and the radio, and I was sitting there in one corner, and he came in, and see, he was 7 years older, almost 8 years older than I was, and he started talking to me, The funny thing was, I had known his sister and known his cousin that lived around the corner. But he had seen me one other time and asked who I was. He asked his cousin who I was. He said, "Who's that little curly-headed girl over there?" My hair was one curl, like Leslie's is now.
Yeah.
And so he said he was taken with me. So we were both in the play at the temple. And it was pretty far away from where I lived. And he said, I left and started to leave. He said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to call my dad to come after me." He said, "Oh, I'll take you home." I said, "Well, I have to ask permission, so I'll have to go ask him." So I called, and see, that was what got him, because I was still childlike. I was childlike. I was 16. Barely 16. And he was 23. So that was a lot of difference.
Sure.
But in those days, you know, I was working. I graduated early because we only had 11 years of school then, and not 12. On top of that, I was put ahead in the lower grades, you know. My mother had cancer and she was going to go to Mayo's to have this operation. So she wanted to put me in school. So she had a maid then that was going to live with us. And I was 5 and not 6. See?
Right, so she wanted you to go to
She
school.
so wanted me to be in school because she had 2 other children to keep. And so what happened was, when I got to the school, the principal said, since my birthday was in July, and I think August was the changing time then, you know, for the grade. And he said, "Well, we don't have a chair, so I'll put her in the first grade." So he put me in the first grade, and by the time the chair came 6 weeks later, they said, "No use to send her to kindergarten, she's doing just fine here." So I was a year ahead of myself. That's the reason I graduated so early.
Gotcha.
I was not 16 till a month after I graduated.
Amazing. Amazing. So Brutus took you home from the play, and
Yeah.
then he didn't see you again until he came to your mother's house, to your house,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
So how did you feel? He told us how he felt. How did you feel?
Oh, well, I was all taken with him because he was a grown, you know, handsome. He'd been a football player. And he his group was much older than mine. You know, I would see him sometime at those dances, but I'd never dance with him because he was so much older, you know what I mean?
Right.
So I was all taken with him because I knew his sister and his cousin. I was real good friends with his sister and his cousin.
Did you like him? Were you?
And that's Ron Swartz's sister, aunt.
Isn't that funny?
You know, Dr. Swartz in Rochester.
Amazing.
And Brutus was real close with Ron's dad.
Isn't that something?
And then we all got together on that trip. That was the greatest trip.
What trip? Tell us.
The Disney trip, because we wanted to take the children and everything. We took a 3-day trip, you know, to the islands. We went to that Atlantis. It was so beautiful. And the kids, they were in 7th heaven. Like Leslie's kids, she got them walkie-talkies. And she would call them every hour. But we would hear from them more often because they'd run out of money. They wanted to buy this or that.
Always, always. So how did Brutus get to ask you out? How did you?
Well, he asked me to dance at the temple. It was a temple dance, you know. And I told him, I said, I don't know if my mother let me go. You'll have to ask her. Because really, my father, I was his favorite, and he was very picky about me. I don't think he was just like a mother hen with me. So the thing was, I'd never been out on a date. And up until that time, they would drive me, you know, and pick me up. Wouldn't let me go out in a car with the boy. But since he was older, I think he talked to him. Brutus always was a good salesman. He really was.
So he took you to the dance.
And then we
was that
started going to, but my parents wouldn't let me go with anybody but one time a week. They said familiarity breeds contempt. You're not going, you can't, you're too young to get too friendly with anybody. So actually the only time I went, well, one time, because there was an extra party, I went with 2 times in a week and I had to sit at home the next 3 weekends. They wouldn't let me go out. And he was so mortified because he was a grown man.
And then how, okay, so you continued to go out once a week and then,
Yeah.
and then,
And then after I graduated, then everybody I knew, some of them were going to the Army and some of them were going, you know, things were getting bad. And so then she let me go with it because I was a graduate of high school. You can't have your mother and father take you forever in their car, you know. I was working.
what were you doing?
I was working in an optometrist's office. See, because I played the piano, I was real good at typing.
So you were running the office.
And he'd pick me up every day and take me home. So that meant he started eating dinner every night at our house.
And that was it. And how
And
did
that
he
was
propose to you? Do you remember?
That I cannot remember. It sort of just became like it was going to be the thing,
Uh-huh.
you know.
Right.
Because if you eat dinner with, and they bring you home every night from work, you have know something's going on.
Right. That's right. So you got married, and what was your wedding like?
Well, we had a peculiar wedding because the rabbi in Fort Worth left. He was hired for California. And the rabbi here, Dr. Lefkowitz, retired. There wasn't a rabbi. The only person there was a young man named Stanley Brobb. He was the assistant rabbi to Rabbi Lefkowitz. And wait a minute, Jorge, I want you to, and I was talking about what?
Your wedding. Not that they never
yeah.
got.
And so the rabbi's wife was having a baby any minute. So would you believe we had to have the wedding at his house?
In Dallas.
Yes. Everybody, his grandmother and his mother and dad and my mother and dad came over here and we had the wedding at his house and then we all went to the Adolphus.
Did you, I mean, what was it like? You know,
It was just everything was in a state of flux in those days because the war was pending, you know?
right.
And we were married in 36.
So right, all the tension was so high.
So the tension was so high. And it was just the tail end of the... Brutus was very fortunate. He was going to go to the CCC, did he tell you?
No.
Well, because there weren't any jobs. And he was going to go to the CCC. And he was the same way. He was in his father's store.
What was this?
And the insurance man came in, who he went to work for, Mr. Seligman.
Right.
And he said, Daddy Sam, he said, do you know someone that could drive me? I'm not able to drive anymore. And so his Daddy Sam said, well, what about my son here? Sure enough, he hired him. And he eventually bought that business.
Right.
But the man never had any children. And he was crazy about Brutus. Brutus even lived with me. He lived in the Texas Hotel, which is now the Hyatt.
That's something amazing.
But it's funny how things how you meet people like that.
Right.
Because if he hadn't been in his father's store that day, he'd have been gone to the CCC. which was like the ROTC or something, but what they did, the government was furnishing money to fix, they made Lake Worth beautiful.
That's what
But
the
then all-
CCC did.
Huh?
That's what the CCC
That's what they did parks. They had places to barbecue, places to go fishing, places
Wow, wow,
to look out places.
right. So what was it, so you got married, and where did you live? Tell me
Oh,
about
we
the early
lived,
memories of your marriage.
oh, the funny thing was, we moved on Hemphill Street. We moved in this apartment that was absolutely beautiful. It was built, and it would be like this apartment would be today. You know, on the bed, it was on Hemphill Street.
Right.
And the people went broke. So Brutus made $32.50 a week, and we paid $32.50 a month rent, all bills paid.
Wow.
But just, and he was really lucky. He had a car furnished,
Wow.
and so actually, he did very well.
Right. And how long, or what was it like being married at first? Was it what you thought it would be like? What was it?
Well, I was pretty spoiled. It was pretty bad for him, I guess. Because, you know, when my mother would say to me, Bernice, it's your time to wash the dishes tonight. So the minute dinner was over, I'd run and start playing the piano, you know. And my father would come in there and say, my mother would come in and say, Bernice, get in there and wash those dishes. My father would say, Dina, everybody can wash dishes, but not everybody can play the piano. So I'd keep playing until my brother and sister finished the dishes, then I'd quit.
Did you get along well with your brother and sister?
Sure, mostly my brother. But my sister was handicapped, and I was a tomboy, like I told you. So I was used to going fishing and this and that and the other, you know. She didn't do anything like that. But this is what is so funny. My father, even though he knew I was a tomboy, like, when I got ready to go fishing, he'd make me put on all these long sleeve shirts and a hat this big and gloves. And here I was, this little thing with this great big hat and these covered up from head to toe. And I thank him because my complexion would probably have been ruined.
Right.
Because I was in the sun too much.
Right.
And later we bought a beach house in Galveston. And I was used to doing that, so I didn't sit in the sun or sunbathe, you know.
That's smart.
Oh, well, it's because of my father.
Right.
I have him to thank.
So you moved into this apartment on Hemphill.
And it was just beautiful. And Morton was born 2 years later. And then we lived there till he was 2, and we bought a house. Brutus there's a young lady that lives here, her name is Helen Ann Hurst. She was Helen Ann Carr. And her father and Brutus were good friends. He was a real estate man, and also he was an appraiser. And in insurance, Brutus used him a lot, you know, with the appraisals and things on houses. And so he came to Brutus and said, Brutus, I'm building a new addition. They're going to extend Stadium Drive, and you ought to get one of the houses. Well, we couldn't anymore afford, we just had a baby, and we couldn't afford a house, actually. So he said, Brutus said, well, I'd love to get it, but I don't have a down payment. He said, I'll show you how to get it. And we took a lien on our furniture. We had our own furniture.
Wow.
And we took a second mortgage on our furniture and got the down payment. And we paid $3,500 for a 2-bedroom house. And that was so funny because when the war started and everything, we had to have another bedroom because we were going to have another baby. And Sandy was already sick by that time. you know. And our youngest son had cancer. We found it out, they said he had polio, but we found out it was cancer when he was about 3.
Wow.
And so he needed to be downstairs. And Morton was in school and he didn't need to be getting up all hours of the night, you know. So we decided we'd take in the attic and build a room, which we did. And when we built that room, it cost $6,500, twice as much as that.
Amazing.
That's showing you how inflation,
How did our...
things, you know, things were just going up.
Right. Were you happy? Were you happy?
Oh, happier than a lot.
And did you get along well with Brutus's family?
Always. His mother always called me when I took her to get the bread each week. And if she wanted to buy any clothes, she always asked me to go with her. We never had a cross word.
Amazing. You were still close with Brutus's sister.
Yeah, but she moved away. She moved during the war to Washington, married a fellow from Philadelphia, so she was away.
Right.
But we'd go see them and they'd come see us.
And what was it like? So Morton then went to school when...
Right down the street on Stadium Drive on Blue Bonnet.
So you'd walk him to school in the mornings.
I wouldn't walk him, he'd walk himself. It was just a block.
Right.
We were just a block from the school. And he was a good student always. Except when he got in the 6th grade, he was, in the 5th grade, he was pretty smart, but that teacher knew how to handle it. Miss Kinray, I'll never forget it, she was our neighbor. And she'd call me and she'd say, Miss Meyerson, can Morton come over this morning? He can help me grade papers. I said, yes. And he'd go. Well, when he got in the 6th grade, he got a new teacher, Miss Vickery. She was cute, but she didn't know how to handle kids that age. She was too young now. And so he came home with the first report card, and he had D in deportment.
Deportment.
And I said, that's not Morton. Something is wrong here. So I went marching down to the school, you know, and Sandy was sick by that time. And I said to the principal, I just don't understand this. I'd like to talk to his teacher. So she called her and she came and she said, well, he's always getting in trouble. Next Gail Peterson was this little Swedish-looking girl with these long golden braids. He'd stick them in the inkwell.
Did he really?
Yes, he did. But and I said to her, well, don't you, she said, and the thing is he gets through with his work and he doesn't have to double check it because he knows he hasn't missed anything. And so he's bored and he gets in trouble. I said, well, then why don't you get him to help you? She said, help me? What do you mean? I said, well, he used to help Miss Kingrave grade papers. Oh, she said, I couldn't do that. That's punishment. I said, well, it wasn't punishment to him. He liked doing it. But she, certainly, then she started doing it and everything was all right.
What was it, you know, can we talk about Sandy? Are you comfortable
Oh,
with that?
yeah, sure.
So what was it like? How did you know? I mean, how did
Well, the trouble was, Sandy started, he started skipping on one foot, like sideways. He couldn't. Well, we thought it was funny at first because, you know, it was funny because he was going sideways. And he wasn't but 3, so, you know.
You thought it was a cute kid
He
then?
thought it was just a thing. But then he started crying in his sleep. And I had all these doctors. They said he had polio. He and Morton were both sick and had about 102 or 3 fever for a week. And when it was over, then Sandy started doing this limping. So we had Louis Levy, who was an orthopedic surgeon in Fort Worth. That had been our friend. And all these years, you know, we'd been friendly with them. They had a daughter, and she was in Morton's class, And his wife and I would walk Morton and Rosalind. And so one day he kept crying in his sleep. And I said to Brutus, something is wrong. And I'd ask the pediatrician, I'd ask him, and I'd ask everybody, and they'd say, well, you're turning out to be a neurotic mother. I said, no, I'm not. That isn't my type. But anyway, I went to my father, and he was a Shriner. And at that time, the Scottish Rite Hospital here was a polio hospital. Only polio. But they only took indigent people. Now they take everybody. But at that time, the polio was so bad, you know, and rampant, that they were swamped. The only thing they knew was Sister Kinney's treatment with the hot packs, you know. They didn't have a medicine or a vaccine for it. So I said to my father, I said, well, you've been a Shriner all these years. I don't want him to go over there and take advantage of getting the treatment when somebody, you know, can't pay for it. I said, but I want to find out what's wrong with him. So he called the president of the shrine, and they made arrangements for him just to go through the clinic. And they found the mass. He had cancer, and it was down here near his groin. And it was a different kind of cancer. It was neurosarcoma. And which is like a tapeworm. And as it grows on the nerve, it kills the nerve. So whatever nerve it grows on, it kills that nerve. So eventually, you know, he was crippled. And then a doctor, what was his name? From MIT, forgotten his name. I know it just as well as anything. He was the head of that Farber, Dr. Sidney Farber. He was the head of the hospital, and all they did is study cancer in children under 16. So he was coming down here for a meeting. So our pediatrician arranged for him to see Sandy. And when he did, he told us, he said, the way it looks to me like it's going to his brain, and then everything will stop because he won't, you know. But it didn't. It went to his kidneys and his liver. And then they just, you know, when it got that, he lived 3 years. Wow. He died in May, but in August he would have been 6.
Wow. And what was it?
It's called neurosarcoma.
And what was it like for you,
Well, it was easier on me because it was terrible. We tried with Morton, like, I would take him to a show once or twice a week. We couldn't go off and leave Sandy, because in those days there weren't any nurses that knew anything about it. And I learned to catheterize him and everything like that, because I didn't want him to be in the hospital all the time. Then if he would get a kidney infection, I'd go nutty. And the doctor would tell me, he'd say, Bernice, they get kidney infections from catheterizing in the hospital. Don't try to be exceptional. Well, but of course you could see I'd be upset, because he'd be so sick, his fever would get 105. Then I'd have to take him to the hospital, you know. But soon as they didn't have anything.
Right.
See, they didn't have penicillin or any of that.
So you would go to the shows to kind of relieve the tension?
And so naturally I'd take him to shows I liked. And that's how he got interested in Shakespeare. He loved Shakespeare. And all the good shows I'd take him to. Then Brutus would take him to the show.
So you like both. That's why he likes both.
Yeah.
And what was Sandy like?
Sandy was very sensitive and smart. As smart as Morton is, he might have been smarter. But he might have been that way because he was ill and perceptive. You know, when it's like if you're born blind, something else develops.
Mhm.
Right.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And you excel in some other form.
So he was very sensitive to people.
Very sensitive to people. And he would always pick out my Christmas presents. He saw this like satin gown in the paper, and he'd say, "Daddy, that's what you have to buy Mother for Christmas." And he loved it because he liked the feeling.
It was so
you know?
soft. It's just
Yeah.
smooth, I mean. Yeah.
Smooth,
Yeah.
soft.
Yeah. So then after Sandy passed away, did you stay in that house? Did you move?
Yeah, well, we stayed there till Morton was in college
Wow.
because everybody came to our house. All the kids came to our house. And that was such a blessing because I wanted to adopt another child, see? And Dr. Allison was his name. And he was Brutus's fishing partner, good friends. And he told me, "Bernice, I don't think you should adopt another child." Even in those days, he said, there's so many children abused and not taken care of. Go find something that you can do for them. Well, so then, for instance, they started the Down syndrome thing, association. Well, they didn't have a piano, so I played the accordion, and I'd go over there and play all the time. And Miss Gladney, where we lived on Hemphill, she had bought this great big house next to us and had her thing there, but they had no piano. They couldn't afford a piano in those days. And I'd go there on Christmas, Easter, New Year's, whatever, and play. So that's when I started doing that. You know, and then I volunteered during the war out at the Veterans Hospital because they had a lot of people that were addicted in the South Pacific. You know, they didn't have any doctors, so they'd just shoot them with morphine. And they couldn't take a piano in there because they got addicted to the needle as well. And they'd try to cut the strings out of the piano.
Wow.
You know? But I went there till I moved here. And then they changed it to a halfway house for addicted children.
Huh. So did you always just stay very involved in the social
Always.
services side of the community?
And then from the temple, they had a black school around, there were segregated schools in those days, about 3 blocks from the temple. And in those days, they were already having trouble reading. And I was one of the volunteers. We went once or twice a week over there to try to tutor the children. And even in those days, you could see how things were changing with the parents because the parents didn't want them to come. They didn't want them to be bothered. They wanted them to come home with their sister or their brother from school. You know, and they didn't care that they were learning.
Right.
It was pretty discouraging. As a matter of fact, the temple finally stopped doing it because they didn't want us to go in the neighborhood.
Interesting. So would you go home at night and talk about it? Is that where more got his interest in?
I think-
Real,
I think
down-to-earth social service?
I think so.
Interesting. How did your family celebrate holidays?
Our family always were, my mother and father were religious. We celebrated every holiday. Now, Brutus was Orthodox and they didn't.
You know what he said to me on the phone the other day?
What?
He said, in fact, he wanted to add onto the tape that he discovered that as soon as he stopped being Orthodox and started being Reformed, that's when his heartburn went away.
His mother was a good cook.
Good. Did you do it in your house? Did you do Shabbat? Did you have the holidays?
Yes, we did, but it wasn't as pronounced as it was. We had Purim, and I took Morton for every holiday, you know, to the temple, every celebration, and he was confirmed. There was no bar mitzvah.
And really, that temple didn't have them.
No, they didn't have them. They had them at the shul.
And did they have Sunday school?
Oh, yeah, and he was good at Sunday school and even taught in Sunday school later.
But they didn't have a bar mitzvah, did it?
And I taught in Sunday school.
Did you really?
So I think that's the reason he taught in Sunday school.
Right. What'd you teach?
Let's see, I think they were about 5th or 6th graders. And I loved to teach with hands-on things. For instance, whatever story we were studying, because I thought they were old enough, I'd tell them to all bring an article out of the paper. Some thing that was happening in the world that pertained to the same situation. Because they had a hard time connecting the olden days to the present. But I would say, you know, nothing changes. You have to learn certain principles of honesty, integrity, etc., and humanity.
Right.
And you'll find those in the newspaper because nothing's changed.
Right. Interesting. Interesting. But tell me about your. Did you used to still then keep going to Kansas City, and did you have
Every
a close
summer.
family?
Always.
Even with Morton and
Oh,
Sandy
yeah. I couldn't go when Sandy was sick.
Right, but when he was a baby and
Yeah.
stuff like that, you went.
Yeah. And we always went up to Kansas City in the summer. And when I was little, you know, still
Right.
at home, we stayed 3 weeks with one side of the family and 3 weeks with the other side of the family.
Do you ever wish that when you lived there, I guess by the time you got to Fort Worth, you had
I was 6
family
weeks
already?
old.
I mean, you already had family was beginning to come, but was it
Yeah.
was it different? I mean, do you think things would have been different if you had lived in Kansas City, if you had stayed there? How different would your life have been?
I think it would have been more closed.
Mm-hmm.
There were more Jewish people and there were more segregation.
Right.
Except my mother's father and his family. He was the kind of man, he was Orthodox. And, but he told my mother, he said, don't worry with it, it's something I've done and I'm used to. But he said, since we have refrigeration, kosher means clean, and I know you keep a clean house, and it's not necessary, so we never kept kosher.
Right.
That's the reason we did.
Right.
Because he didn't make my mother feel guilty because she wasn't doing it.
Nice. Very nice.
You know.
Family. Yeah. Yeah.
And when he died, I'll never forget, every race, every creed, and everything was at his funeral. It was the biggest funeral you ever saw.
Amazing. What was his last name?
Schleifstein.
Schleifstein. Okay, I'll have to ask around.
But they all changed their name, but him to Stein.
Huh.
And the thing was, I don't know if his father died or something, and his mother married this German doctor. I still can't find. When we got this, we were tracing the Schleifsteins back to Europe. None of them were Jewish.
Well, yeah. Huh.
I don't know if that was intermarriage or he was a German. You know, they brought a lot of Germans to Russia and Lithuania.
Sure.
Especially doctors and engineers.
Sure.
Peter the Great started doing that.
Yeah. Exactly, because they wanted to develop that area. That's how they did
right.
it. That's right. Just like the West here. Just like how your family got to Fort Worth.
Exactly.
The same ways.
But I'll tell you a funny story about my great uncle that brought my father down. He was way before his time. If you'd see him, he wore this snap brim hat like the Germans do. He dressed in these clothes just like he was in Germany and smoked a big cigar. And one day something came up when he died. There was all this property way down there on at the end of Texas where Big Bend Park is. And this piece of land was isolated. You had to go through somebody else's ranch to get to it. And we always wondered what in the world he did. It was a rocky place. Nothing could be there but goats. What in the world did he do with that? And when my father had all these cousins in Germany left, because when my uncle brought his sisters, one sister stayed because she was married to a general in the Kaiser's army, and he didn't want to leave, you know, in World War I. So by the time World War II came, the family was bigger, you know, and all spread out. But anyway, my father brought them over, and they arrived in Fort Worth the day Sandy was born. No, Morton was born.
Wow.
On June the 3rd,
Wow.
1938. And they came to our house. And they had 2 children. And this one boy, by then, you know, I was all grown up and had a family and everything, but his wife was really helped me. She taught me to needlepoint. She taught me to crochet. She taught me she was really knew all the finer things in life. And up until that time, I'd been a real-time boy. But anyway, then he was very close to their oldest son. And I don't know if you know him. Do you know Ron Hersfeld? Anyway, Uncle James used to tell him stories. He's the one that told him the story about, you know, they went on the land drive in Oklahoma.
Right.
And the other story said, asked me, he said, Uncle Jake, what did you do with that property down in the Big Bend? You never went there. Oh, he said, yes, I did too. That was before you were born. He said, well, what did you do with it? He said, I used to buy guns and I sold them to Pancho Villa and all those people.
No way. That's amazing. He was a gun runner. That's incredible. Incredible.
And supplying foodstuffs, you know,
Amazing.
for the army.
Amazing.
But we finally sold that to the man that had the ranch next to it.
Amazing. So tell me, what are you most proud of? Now let's get into like sort of your feelings now about life and things. Now about yourself. You're like, this is about you.
Yeah. Well, I am so proud of my grandchildren, great-grandchildren too. You know, I'm crazy about them. And I'm so happy we found Leslie because she's more like me than I am. That's the truth. Because the first time she walked in this house, she said, oh, you have blue and white. Well, she had a blue living room with white. And she walked in the kitchen to eat breakfast with me. She said, I have these dishes, those dance dishes. And when she came here for the first Passover, you know, she said, I can't believe these. They're Rosenthal china, white china. She said, I have these same dishes.
Unbelievable.
Isn't that strange?
Amazing. Amazing.
That we pick out the same thing.
Right. Amazing. And so now the families just really come together.
Oh, yeah. Very well. And the thing about it is, I say that that's Hannah. So, because she's in love with Miles, her only grandson.
Perfect.
And she even went to the bar mitzvah and didn't open her mouth because he was talking every once in a while. She thought she missed what he was going to say. Morton was holding her. And when he'd sit down in the seat, you know, he's kind of little, she'd make him, Morton prop her up and let her stand so she could see his head.
Amazing.
So funny.
Amazing. So Hannah's brought everybody together.
Yeah,
That's
I'd say
wonderful.
so.
That's wonderful.
I said to her, I think it's so nice of Natalie and Miles to take you dancing. She was the funniest thing. She was doing everything the grown-ups were doing. She was doing that. She was crossing her feet, clapping, you know, on time. She's got a lot of rhythm.
Oh, she comes by it honestly.
So I said to her, I said, Hannah, I think it's just wonderful that Natalie and Miles are teaching you to dance. She said, not Natalie, Miles.
She's whooped. She's whooped.
Thank you, Jorge, very much.
Okay.
Do you have any advice or thought that you want to give your granddaughters on marriage? I mean, you have one of the most successful, long-lived marriages. You're
Well,
a
thank
tremendous
you.
role model.
Well, we have our differences, as everybody does, but the thing is, they're both married to such, I think this is very unusual. Both of them are married to successful, wonderful, loving men. I mean, Jamie, as busy as he is, he still gives Hannah a bath every night and spends time with her, reads to her, and puts her to bed. Because he knows Marty doesn't have that much time anymore. And Rob is a wonderful father. So I think we're very fortunate. And I tell them all the time, the girls, I say, you just don't know how fortunate you are to have husbands like this.
And was Brutus was, I mean, you had a...
He wasn't like that at all.
He wasn't?
No. But he was a good father. For instance, if he'd go golfing, he'd put Morton in a rock wagon and pull him around with him, you know?
Right.
And Brutus is a man with a lot of integrity, really, and honesty. And he taught Morton that was the most important thing in life. Not how much money you made, but what people thought of it.
Well, Moore was very lucky, and is very lucky to have, I mean, you're the same way. So.
He was the apple of my eye, of course.
Well, he knows, just like
He
you.
knows it.
That's right, you betcha, you betcha. Is there anything else you want to share with us?
Well, I can't think of anything else. Those were the highlights. If I think of anything else, I'll do like Brutus. I'll call you to come
That's
back.
right. Ron, is there anything that I should have asked that I didn't think of? That's it. Great.
That's an overview of This Is Your Life.
That's right.
Bernice Meyerson.
That's right.
Dressman Meyerson.
That's right. That's great.
That's the only thing that irritates Bruce. I put Bernice G. Meyerson. And Tom Luce told me to do that. He said, you know, when you die, you don't know. If you put Bernice Meyerson, you don't know who can claim something.
Wow.
That a woman should put her initial from her maiden name.
Interesting.
And then I kind of poo-pooed it in my mind. And 2 weeks later, I was reading Gourmet magazine, and there was a girl signed her name on a recipe, Bernice Meyerson.
So there you go.
So I went out and changed everything. Isn't that interesting?
Yes. All right. Well, I'm glad I'm still using shorts.